Hey guys, welcome to Everyday Guitarist, where we're not demoing anything today. We're going to be talking about bass tones. I get this question a bunch, so let's just get into it. First of all, guys, if you've subscribed, please do that. I really appreciate it. I love doing these videos. I really love helping people, and hopefully this can help you out. So hit the bell notification, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. It helps me to continue to do this. I'm going to do just a really quick overview of the gear I'm using. For the most part, it is all really easily attainable stuff. It's all under $1,000 by a huge margin. Today I'm going to use a MIDI bass. I have a real bass, but the MIDI bass just sounds so good, and it's really even, and I'm an awful bass player. It's the Waves Rickenbacker bass. It sounds awesome, and it's got a great DI sound. I'm using Parallax, which is a bass distortion plugin. And lastly, I am using Darkglass B7K plugin, which is also great, very similar to the Parallax, but just does it a little different way. It's a little more round sounding, and I really like that. And then the rest of the stuff is all free plugins, EQs, compressors, stuff like that. So before we really get into my thoughts on how I go about doing bass, the very first thing I do when I record bass, either recording or using the MIDI thing, is I split it into two tracks. And I have a distorted track, and then I have a clean track. And I process them slightly differently so that they kind of fill in different voids in the mix. So here's the distorted bass track. Here's the clean bass track. And here's what it sounds like all together. Three really important things in making really great bass tone: compression, EQ, and volume. And I'm going to try and cover all those as succinctly as possible. We'll see how I do. So the first thing I do is compression. I think it's the most important part. And for anybody who doesn't know what compression is, I know compression can be really scary. I'm no expert, but essentially the best way I've found to describe compression is it makes loud parts quiet and quiet parts loud, and just makes everything even. And that's a really important thing with bass, because bass has a lot of really big transients and a lot of really low lows. And it helps just even everything out, makes it fill out and sound big, and that's a really big part of making bass work. There's two schools of thought on compression. You can either compress really hard with one compressor, or you can compress in increments. Those are kind of my thoughts on it, and I compress in increments. I do a pretty low ratio between 3 and 5, usually around 4. I set the attack so that the pick attack of my bass comes through just a little bit, and then I back it up just a hair. You want to hear the pick attack of the bass, but you don't want that transient. You don't want it to be so loud that all you're hearing is clicking when you hear the notes of the bass. I then set the release to essentially the beat of the music. You want it to compress when it hits the note and let go before the next beat hits, so that you don't get that pumping sound. You want it to go just with the music. My second point is EQ. You want to EQ everything. And I do a pretty extensive amount of EQing on my bass, because I'm trying to make it fit into guitars. I usually have an EQ on my bus, and then I have an EQ on my clean track. I usually do a low pass around 800 hertz. I don't want a bunch of high end. That clean track is essentially just filling out sub and low frequencies and being a little distorted, so it fills everything out and feels big. And then on the bus, I have a bunch of mids scooped out. I usually have a little sub, and then you're gonna have to make a notch and find where your pick attack is, and then boost that up a little bit. That's how I go about getting that really clicky, kind of angry bass sound for punk. It's kind of glassy and jangly sounding. EQ is really important, and you want to make sure you don't overdo it, because things start to sound kind of weird if you go too far and start cutting and boosting random stuff. I'm no expert, that's just how I go about it, and I know that can be kind of confusing, but less is more when it comes to EQ generally. I generally just find the frequencies I don't like, get rid of them, and then add stuff back in that I do like. Lastly is volume. There's generally two ways to mix bass. Either louder than the guitars or quieter than the guitars. Bass that's louder than guitars makes the mix sound really big and full and massive. I prefer that, although I try to find a balance between that and the second point, which is mixing it slightly quieter than the guitars, which in my opinion results in a more aggressive sound. It's a little more angry and a little more gnarly. The bass blends a little differently. And then the other thing is balancing those two tracks. You want to find a good balance between that really gnarly distorted track, and you want to find a good balance between that like bass sub low end track. And that just is going to differ from song to song and how your guitars sound. So now that I kind of explained all that, I'm going to give a couple Brett's quick tips on bass tone. First thing is the low sub bass track. You want to make sure when you're EQing that low end, I usually put a low pass around 800 hertz. You want to make sure that sub bass isn't getting in the way of your kick drum. There's a lot of that frequencies between 60 and 80 hertz that can really get muddled when you're doing bass and kick together. You want to just kind of make sure that you're not getting in the way of that. That just takes practice and listening and understanding the frequencies, and you'll get that. It's just something that's going to take a little bit of time. With compression, I know it can be scary. Mostly it's going to be a bunch of messing around and kind of figuring out how it works and understanding that red bar and what it's doing. And listening for that pick attack and finding that sweet spot where the pick attack's coming through, but it's tamped down enough that it's not just a bunch of clicky, gross mess. And then just finally striking a balance between distorted and clean bass, and then finding that place where it sits in the mix really, really well. That's going to take, once again, just practice and understanding and feeling out what is going to fit best with the guitars and drums and everything else in that mix. And that's more of a gluing the mix together kind of thing. You'll learn that as you do it more. So let's listen to the song now and see how the bass sits in the mix. I'll solo a couple parts in the mix so you can hear how they all just kind of sit together. And that'll kind of give you an idea of how I use it all in context. So here's the song. Once again, guys, thanks for watching. I really appreciate it. Hopefully I was able to kind of condense this all down into a digestible little piece. I know I rambled a lot, but it's a lot of information to try and condense down into a little part. Hopefully that was helpful. I know it can be a lot to do, and bass is not guitar, and it's very much its own thing, and it's just a matter of doing and learning, just like any skill. Once again, I'm not an expert, but hopefully that was helpful. Thanks again for watching, and I'll talk to you later.